To start, well, just introduce yourself, your name, your ethnic background, and where did you grow up? And then how long have you been at Stonecrest?
I'm Jeshua. I am Chinese, and I've grown up here in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, even though I was born in Hong Kong. And I've been attending Stonecrest for since 2007, 2008.
Hey, I'm Anna. I am Chinese. My dad's from Singapore and my mom's from Taiwan. And I grew up in New Providence, Basking Ridge area. And I've been attending Stonecrest since I'd say 2014, 2015, around then.
So I'm Andy Ma, and both my parents are Chinese from southern China, and I keep getting from people that they don't think I look Chinese, sort of like the universal Asian face or something. I don't know.
I can see it.
But I grew up in Canada, and then I moved to the US in 1993, and then we've been at Stonecrest since about 2008.
I'm Austin Sue. My family is Chinese, specifically from Hong Kong. I've been in Stonecrest for probably like 18, 17 years. My family is originally from New York. My mom's from like the Lower East Side of New York. My dad's actually from Harlem. So I actually have a good amount of New York influences in my life, but mostly I grew up here.
It's interesting as I thought about this whole Asian American Pacific Islander month and just celebrating the heritage of figuring out how long Asians have been in North America. And there's all sorts of different theories that Asians might have even been here 15,000 years ago, going across the Bering Bridge. But to know that, there's these typical stereotypes, right? That you've probably heard the term the perpetual foreigner, where even though we grew up here, many of us born here, that people continue to look at you as if you don't belong here. Or you've heard that they talk about the model minority, where we're the ones who have succeeded and do well or don't have a lot of the issues. But I think a lot of those stereotypes really prevent us from being seen as individuals. The past 2 years obviously have been tough, with COVID, school online, and everything like that. But I think one of the more sobering things has been reading or seeing or hearing about like a lot of the anti-Asian sentiment, the blame for COVID or things like that. As you guys have seen, heard, or read about the attacks on Asian Americans, how did that make you feel, or how does it make you feel even now when you hear about it?
I think I remember hearing about those and seeing those on the news were upsetting, but I don't think it really hit me until I was preparing to come back to campus. So I'm a student in Philadelphia. So as I was preparing, I think, to come back to campus and even talking to my fellow friends who are Asian American about how they're processing that and how they're also preparing to come back to the city, there was definitely more of that kind of fear of how might this affect my day-to-day, and how might even just walking around in the city be different than how I had done, knowing more that these events had occurred and things like that. I think it moved more from this is something that my race and ethnicity has been experiencing, into like, oh, this is something that I could actually face or encounter in my day-to-day life. So I think that's been a shift. I think when there was news about something that happened in Queens, New York. I think that also affected me and got my mind going as well, because I have family and grandparents in that area. And so just thinking about, oh, that could be a place where my grandparents could have frequented. It's like, it definitely affects you and be like, wow, this actually could hit closer to home, you know? So
I think for me, during whole COVID, you just see on like Instagram, just like the news of like, oh, like someone who's of Asian descent or like identifies had like was like beaten up, was killed, was abused in some sort of way. That's all that I've experienced. I've just found myself to like just be blessed enough to be in this multicultural areas alone.
One of the initial thoughts I had when they all started happening was thinking, sort of like Anna, you're saying, like it could be my parents or my grandparents that were the target of those, that they could have been the ones that were jumped or beat up or attacked. And that got me upset, thinking that, you know, especially within Asian culture, like there's such a high regard and respect for the elderly, right? And so many of these attacks were on the elderly. So it just felt so disrespectful or so, you know, it was just, it's preying on the weak. And so it just made me upset. But, you know, and it's sad because over time, like when that shooting at the Taiwanese church in Southern California, right? I got so numb to these attacks on Asian Americans that you don't really think much about it anymore. And you sort of just, you know, I've talked to a lot of our African American brothers and sisters, and over time, there comes a numbness, or just it's sort of like a fatalism that, well, here we go again, and nothing's changing.
You know, I just, the thought of if I wasn't around or and something happened to my grandmother, that would you know, make me want to do some ungodly things. Even the young Asian people in the city are getting attacked too. Yeah, it just hurts every time I see it.
even for me, I feel more numb to my people group, and my heart breaks for the Black community and all that. But I guess something that I've been thinking about is like, what is our calling for our community, and how do you see change to happen for, you know, us as Asian Americans?
I would just say care for everybody. Doesn't, you know, be kind to everyone. Doesn't matter who they are, even if they hate you, you know, just like what we learn at church, you know. Um, I wouldn't say, oh, we gotta treat these people more nicely, these people more nicely, but just treat everyone nicely, you know. Care for everyone, protect everyone, you know. We all live the same life, bleed the same way. So
And I think like one of the things is definitely like keeping like your culture alive as much as like you're able to and comfortable with. But not being afraid to also like live it out in like other areas or like bring out in like other groups or friend groups, I think is one thing. Because when it comes to with like the way laws are like written and the government alone, like that's like very deep, like etched in stuff from like years before that a lot of people have lived and tend to live, and it's hard to change stuff like that. Like Austin said, like being friends with other people, learning to like respect other cultures, but also to implement that in like respecting our own culture and learning to live within our own culture, I think. And as we grow and as the population grows more, like down the road, it's a long fight, but people will learn to respect farther down the road if we don't see it right now.
I guess I sort of see it as a double prong, right? That it's both a larger community effort and then the individual responses. Um, I think one of the things that I've been challenged with is the whole idea of grace, having grace for other people, but also um, asking for grace from other people. as I recognize my own shortcomings and my own biases and prejudices, when I recognize it, that I have to be humble enough to call myself out and apologize for it, and to try to allow God to redeem that, or at least to sort of work it out of me. But I think at the same time, recognizing that on a larger scale, that there's times when maybe I have to speak up, or I have to say something, or I have to get involved with an effort to change something. Because I think for so long with the way that I see it, the Asian mentality, right, is that we don't want to stick out, because there's this idea that the nail that sticks up gets pounded down, right? So that if you stand out or if you stand up, that you're just going to either be targeted, or that you're going to be put in your place, or worse. And I think there's times that that maybe God calls us, that we need to say something if we see injustice, if we see someone being mistreated, that we take that risk to say something. But I also think that we step into the hurt that people experience. So I can't just disregard what the Black community has experienced for hundreds of years with Jim Crow laws and just different laws that disadvantage them. And so if I turn a blind eye to it, then it's sort of like I'm not helping myself or my ethnic group, because we're still a minority, and there's always going to be laws or policies or people that seek to make you feel less than, or to discount, or just make you not included. So I think it's tough, but I feel like, I think it's sort of to jump on what you're saying, Austin, that if we can see people as being created in the image of God, regardless of their cultural background and ethnicity, and if we can value them as God's creation, that's got to change the way that I look at them and treat them. But I can't necessarily convince other people to do that by arguing with them, or by fighting with them. It's got to come out of a relationship with them, and that's a risk too, because then it means that I probably have to form a relationship with someone who is very different from me, and who maybe doesn't think the way I do, and who I may find very offensive. But if I have grace, and if I'm supposed to love them like God loves them, then it calls me to reach out to them. And that's a scary thing, I think, for me especially, because it makes me go outside of what I'm comfortable with. And if this guy's offensive, then there's going to be things that I'm offended with that I'm probably going to want to punch him for. But I'm like, how, if I do that, am I part of the problem? Do I perpetuate the problem, or how do I become part of the solution? That's sort of my street corner. No answers.
Yeah.
There's no right answers.
Yeah, I think it starts small. It starts with relationship and connection, and recognizing that we're not the weak ones, and we can rise up, and we do have our voice too. Yeah.
And that raises such a big point for me too, that it's sort of like, for us, where do we find our identity and our worth? Unfortunately, so much of Chinese discipline, from our parents or teachers, it's rooted in shame, right? And when we talk about shame, it's a way of making you feel like you're worthless as a person. And God doesn't work in shame. God works with guilt, but guilt is more of a pinpoint, like a laser pointer, saying this specific thing is something that is keeping you from a full relationship with God. But God will never use like the whole spotlight and go, let me illuminate your life because you are really a bad person. But I think, for me growing up, I remember that there was times when when shame was like the big stick that people would use to discipline me or make me do something. And I'm realizing now as an adult where I'm like, yeah, that was damaging. That was damaging to the way that I viewed myself or my sense of self-worth.
Yeah, and even as a culture, like very saturated in fear as well. And so what would it look like for us to break that, right, as a generation and walk more fully in grace and our identity, and yeah, own our voice and confront when we need to confront and things like that, right? I think we would shift our culture and restore it in a way that's very different than how we've been raised and what's been ingrained in us, you know, of would come second nature.
To bring this, I guess, more on a personal level, for all of us who pretty much grew up here, or at least around here, when you were growing up, did you ever experience outright racism against you, or even were you ever aware of even what they call microaggressions? You know, those little things that people do or say, or how they treat you to make you feel like you're less than or that you don't belong.
Oh yeah, of course. I used like my first job was Burger King. You know, I've had a guy come in, you know, older folk, uh, definitely came in just yelling at me, telling me to smile. You know, I was just doing my job, but you know, he just like called me an Oriental. He's like, "You guys never smile," and I'm just like, "All right, well, I guess like thanks for
Yeah.
your input, my guy." But you know, it's just the daily things you go through. You hear it, and then even at school, you hear everything. You know, makes you numb to the insults. But you know, what am I gonna do? Get mad at everybody? You know?
Basking Ridge is more or less known to be like 40 to 50% Asian populated. And so I didn't really experience anything for the most part. Like I said, like I live in a mostly multicultural background.
I mean, for me, growing up in Canada, it was such a predominantly Caucasian city, and so I remember getting into fights when I was in elementary and middle school for kids who would say, you know, throw racial slurs at me or whatever. But it probably wasn't until it wasn't until I moved to America where I probably experienced the most racism, which is pretty sad. Having said that, and for us having become aware of it or experienced it as we're older, how does that affect the way that you view other people, or how you strive to treat people who are different than you?
I try to see everyone as an individual. I don't like to group people or generalize. It just creates more conflict if you try to generalize. I don't like to get mad at a whole group of people just because one person did something, you know? Because I know plenty of good people from every culture. So
Similar with Austin, honestly. I've lived around like a lot of other people with other different cultures, like Stonecrest alone. I've lived around a lot of people with different cultures, and so like I I haven't there's nothing like built of any aggression or just anything towards them. Like honestly, with the community, I just learned to like, oh, like someone's of a different origin, different nation. Like really interesting. How's that for you? Like where does that go with you? And I just learned more to embrace and to really hate or look down upon any other culture.
Yeah, I think generally we live in a society that is so easily offended, you know, even whether that's social media or just in real life, you know, in conversations and things like that. And so I think it's just so important to have that mindset of to stay curious when interacting with other people, like Joshua mentioned, like to learn more about where people are coming from, their own lens that they're viewing and perceiving things. So even as these things occur, you know, to take it as an opportunity to lean into like further conversations with people and like learn more about their culture and their background. So
I'm realizing just how much racism there is within the Chinese community. The terms that we have for other cultures and other ethnicities, realizing that everyone else is a demon, sort of a guaylo, right? And we're the only people for the term for that. And I think I've been challenged that, they say that racism isn't just a yes or a no question, it's a matter of degrees. And I think within every person, there's a degree of racism because people that don't look like us, they can either be a threat or it's an unknown, right? So some people are uncomfortable with the unknown. But I think typically we have prejudices of some sort, and it may not be cultural or ethnic. It could be socioeconomic. When I'm in New York City and I see the guys in the subways asking for money, I don't necessarily see them as being equal to me, or that there's something that either I have to be scared of or I pity them. But for me, of realizing that, yeah, there's some people that I stereotype when I'm driving. There's certain people groups that I'm like, oh, they're terrible drivers, and I lump them all together. And so it's neat to hear you guys and your experience, because I didn't grow up in such a multicultural area, and to hear your experience and perspective on it, it's interesting for me, and it challenges me because you challenge me to be more open and to be more accepting of others. In your understanding, like, what do you think God has to say about all these differences in culture and ethnicities? Like, what do you think that it was God's intention, and what is God's intention to have such diversity of cultures and ethnicities?
I think he made us all uniquely. We're all human at the end of the day. We all do the same things. We're all trying to live, be happy, provide for our families.
I think for me, it gives me a level of sadness in a way, because the Lord has created us each so individually and beautifully in all of our ethnicities and cultures and backgrounds, and he's given us such a beautiful picture of what heaven should look like, on earth as it is in heaven, right? And here we live in this broken world where that is fragmented, and we see division and words hurled at each other and things like that. But in the end, it is a picture of what heaven should look like. And so, we should all be striving to, like, praying and interceding in that way, that the Lord would just restore and bring that picture of heaven into restoration and redemption, and ultimately, like, bring people closer to what the gospel really is, right? Like, that Christ came for all people, of all races and ethnicities, and how beautiful it would be if we all lived like that and carried the gospel in that light.
Like in the Bible alone, you can kind of see how, like, in like New Testament, right? Paul writes a ton of letters to people of like different like nations, like Corinth or Ephesus. Like, you have different people who are a part of different cultures who struggle with different things, but also are able to like take part in different things. Like, that alone has like a lot of variability. And then you have, like, even in the Old Testament, you have like a lot of like ites, Hittites, Israelites. So you could go through a ton of them. All of them more or less are like of different people who struggle with like different things, but also have different cultures. And a lot of like the times in the Bible, you can kind of see like a lot of imagery, a lot of like metaphor used to pertain to like different cultures. Egyptians are known for like their horses and like treating like them well. And like one point in the Song of Solomon, the guy like compliments the woman as like an Egyptian mare, which means like tends to her beauty and stuff. So like God loves to glorify that a lot. And like nowadays as well, I mean, you kind of see like a lot of people being proud of like the nation that they come from or their culture. And I think God delights in it a lot. I think it's one of the things where um he tries to like differentiate people and tries to show that there's a lot of variability. And I think it's in one way kind of like a way to humble another group of people. So I think like he loves it and he likes to use it in different senses. Because different cultures kind of show like different things or different types of ways to worship for different people. Like at Messiah, we had a group, I think their name was Azaguno, I think was their name. They're like an African worship group. And like they're like, they have like drums, they have dancing. And it's very different compared to like America, where like we don't exactly have dancing. We tend to love more of like LEDs, lights, and acoustic pop or a lot of different stuff. But I think like it comes to show like a lot of like very a little bit variety when it comes to different people and different groups. And I think God just loves to use that and loves to show like there's more than one way to do it. And I think that's part of like the way he uses it. Yeah.
That brings to mind like when the Lord saved us, he didn't strip us of our culture and our identity, right? Like that's all who he made us to be. And you know, like when Jeshua, you were mentioning those examples, it brought to mind in Chinese characters, they're very pictograph form. And so a lot of Chinese characters are made up of other characters. And it's actually cool if you study Chinese characters. There are characters that basically you can tell the gospel story based on those pictographs. So like the Chinese character for boat is made up of the characters of like 8 people and different things like that. And so it's cool how like the Lord even uses those from way back in history's time to point people to God in that way, and use different forms of culture for his glory.
When you were growing up, did your parents try to force you to speak Chinese at home?
Not really. Not really. I don't know if people know this term, but in Spanish, it's like I'm a no sabo, but for Chinese people, which means like, you know, it's like in Spanish or in Hispanic cultures, it's like you're a Spanish person that doesn't know how to speak Spanish. I'm just a Chinese person who doesn't know how to speak Chinese. So
yeah,
it sucks because I get weird looks in you know, when I go to Chinatown or and I'm in those type of gatherings and the old people just are around, you know, they look at me funny because I can't talk to them or, you know, which I wish I could learn, but I still can. But it's something I work for.
Yeah, I feel you. Like there's times when I feel like I don't necessarily fit in any culture, right? Because I'm not Chinese enough to really feel like I'm fully Chinese. I don't speak the language. I don't look white enough to fit in white culture. And so you're sort of straddling 2 cultures or maybe 3 cultures because, you know, for me growing up in Canada and then living here. So do you guys ever feel that you're sort of straddling cultures or straddling society?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I grew up with you know, a lot of Asian people around me, like with my family gatherings and being in part of Chinatown. But when I was in New Jersey, I wasn't around a lot of Asian people. Like I was around Spanish people, I was around white kids, I was around black kids, you know, I was around other races. And then like, you know, sometimes I get bullied by even other Asian people for not knowing the language, or just because I don't act like them, they feel like, I guess, I don't take as much pride as my culture because I'm not like them, but they don't know I come from uh, a New York family, from Chinatown. So I think I've always had trouble knowing where my place is.
Mhm.
It came on and off to me because because I think when I was little, my parents took me to a Cantonese tutor, and I would learn like a little bit, like bits and bits, and then most of it was just because my grandma lived with us at the time, and so like she only spoke Cantonese, and so the only way I could really communicate with her is if I pointed something or like, oh, Cantonese, and like so I'd have to like learn everything, and at the most I could really remember now is just food, so like bolo bao or just like anything along those lines was all that I could really speak and remember now. But when it comes to trying to switch between where I am or how I identify as a culture, or I really didn't struggle with it too much just because I grew up with like around like white people for the most part. Um and I kind of identified with them. The only time I'd ever feel like I was different was oddly enough around Asians, just because I know how to speak Cantonese or Mandarin. And so I'd have friends on the bus who'd like all talk about just sort of like the struggles of like going to Chinese school and learning, and they have like the workbooks with them. And then I'd be sitting next to them, like, I don't have to deal with this at all. And they'd be like, you are so not Asian. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm not that Asian for a time. But then slowly I started to realize, like, no, it's not because you're mad at me because I'm not Asian. You're just mad that I don't have to struggle with that compared to you who has to struggle with that. So I looked at that. But I think one of the big things was when I went to Hong Kong, a lot of my friends there that I was friends with knew how to speak Cantonese, but I didn't. Luckily, they knew English, but it just felt like there was such a cultural disconnect there because of the way that they would speak, and then the fact that I couldn't, and I couldn't participate in some things. Like I remember when I was little, my friends there were at the mall doing a caroling thing that the church had there, and I remember looking down at them from like the second floor, and I could see them, they could see me, and they beckoned me to like go down with them and sing, but I didn't knew any of the words. So I stayed at the top and just like looked down at them, just like wow, I could be there if I could speak Cantonese, but I can't. And so there's a little bit of shame, but surprisingly more from the Asian community than anyone else.
During high school, I went to Singapore, and then in college freshman year, I also went to Taiwan and China right afterwards. And I think for all those experiences, same thing. It's like you're in the culture, you sort of fit in depending on which country it was. I think in Taiwan, my Chinese wasn't fluent enough for me to be just like fit right into the crowd. In the parts of China that I was in, yes, I could speak Chinese and get by in conversation, but even accents of when I was in Beijing, like I didn't speak Beijing Hua, like that's a whole different thing in itself, a whole different dialect and a whole accent that I had to get used to, or even having a mixed skin tone or like differences in that. It's like, oh yeah, I can understand and know what you guys are saying, but even then I appear different.
For me growing up, there was always this animosity, I think, between people who were born here and people who came from overseas, who immigrated. And there was always this bias against people who spoke with an accent as opposed to those who were very fluent in English.
Mhm.
And and Jeshua, I think your experience my experience is similar to yours, where probably most of the the bias and um, prejudice was probably felt within the Asian community. And to me, that as we say that, I'm like, that's kind of sad that that is sort of like within my own ethnic people that
Yeah.
there's more animosity and segregation, division than there are with other cultures.
Mhm. I feel like one of the most interesting things about this though is as far as I go, like I'm more I feel like I identify like with like my mannerisms and everything more towards like American culture. But it's this really weird feeling. Whenever I've been to Hong Kong, or whenever I'm in like Chinatown, I get like this like innate feeling like this is home. Like this is where like I can live. So like Hong Kong, we barely take any cars. Like we just take trains or bus routes. And like all of like the best food you can find are like in these like really run down looking shops where you see like someone who's like in middle school working there, like any of those places. It just seems so unappealing from like an American standpoint, but that's not the standpoint that I look at. I look at it from like a Chinese standpoint. I'm like this feels like home. Like this is a life like innately like I can live and I have lived, but at the same time like I haven't lived, and so it's like it's weird, and I feel like at the same time kind of like mind-boggling that like of like the culture that I associate with, I also like don't associate with at the same time as much. It's very weird.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like earlier this year, we went to Chinatown as a family, and we're walking around, and Jaden is saying, "This is so weird, but I this is probably the first time I feel like I'm not a minority. Actually, everywhere you look, there's Asian faces." And she's like, "It's so weird coming here as opposed to being in New Jersey where you feel like you're one of like a handful of people that look like you."
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand that feeling completely. It's it's a comforting type of feeling, to me at least, just to know that I'm not the only one by myself, or I'm not getting weird looks because I'm the only ethnic person in the room or something. But I understand what she's talking about, for sure.
So the last question that I just want to pose to you guys before we close is, what is something that you're proud of your culture that you'd want to pass on, either to your kids or your younger siblings or younger cousins or just somebody who's younger?
I don't know. I'd like to pass down everything I know about my culture. I
Mhm.
would I would say everything, but I feel like if you don't pass on everything your culture is just gonna be forgotten in your family. And I feel like respecting your elders, no matter what, I think that's something. Respect is something you should earn. Um, I feel like not everybody. I could be smarter than someone who's 80 years old, or have more experience with something else than you know an older person.
Mine was similar, but it's sort of like the flip side of that, Austin. So I agree, that giving people respect just because they're older doesn't always make sense. But I also like the idea of valuing our elders, or at least valuing their wisdom, because I think it's so easy for, especially in Western culture, right? With old people, we tend to sort of discount them, thinking, oh, they're senile, or they're really not in full, all their faculties aren't there, and so we sort of discount what they have to say. And I think one of the things I love doing sometimes is, a lot of times with our youth group before, we would go to like senior homes and just sit and hang out with some of the old people and listen to their stories. So, obviously some of them weren't all there, but some of them who were, they were fascinating conversations.
Mhm.
Um, So just spending the time with them. But yeah, so it's like it's two sides of the coin. There's some that I probably wouldn't want to respect because, like you said, they're entitled to it. But there's others who really are worth listening to and valuing. And I guess it's sort of, I guess you learn that by talking to them, or at least hearing them,
Yeah.
to see do they really have stuff that's valuable that they're offering, or am I, is
Yeah.
it just a bunch of gas?
Along with respecting the elderly, um, this is the big one, but food, I think, is really important. Um, I like to think that like I compensate my lack of understanding Cantonese with like the food that I eat at home, because I think that's probably the biggest part. Um, just because I feel like Asian food tends to have such a different, it's a different thing. Like I don't know if it's different for like other people, but at home, like we've always had like a singular plate where like you put like all of your food on. Like it's always family style. There's never, you barely have like individual food for yourself, except when it comes to like maybe ramen. The food encompasses so much, and it's like a lot of like unappealing things that you don't exactly like at first. So like fish sauce, for example, it smells terrible. It's so bad when you smell it, but then you incorporate with so many other things, and it tastes so good because it adds so much flavor. And it's like it's the having the food is opened me up to like a lot of other different foods, because a lot of the things like you normally look at and you wouldn't want to try it, but then because I think the way my parents cook and all that I've ate, like anything that like seems unappealing, I don't judge it by that first, because I feel like just because it's unappealing doesn't mean it can't taste good. I am so grateful for like all the food that my parents have cooked and like shown me throughout the years, because like I can eat anything at this point. And I think like that's just a good thing to pass on to my kids or generations later, just because learning how to like make food, like even like making dumplings handmade, like that's an art alone.
Yeah, and I was thinking with that though, it's sort of implied that if you're eating family style, like if there's one main dish and everyone eats off that main plate, that means that you're having dinner together.
Yeah.
Right? Was that a big thing within your families, that dinner time is expected that everyone was at the table together?
Mhm.
Yep.
Yes, for sure. You don't start until everyone's there.
Yeah, pretty much. Like the only time someone wouldn't be there is if they had like something scheduled that they had to take. Otherwise, like you would have to be at the family table.
Yeah. And it's funny because one of the benefits of COVID that I read was that families had dinner together more often.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, well, we always did that, so nothing
Yeah,
changed.
yeah, yeah. That's one of the better parts of it. That and chopsticks too. I want my kids to know how to use chopsticks. It's great.
That's the minimum.
Well, relating to the food, it's like, yeah, when it's almost like instead of a greeting of how are you, right there, like, oh, have you eaten yet in Chinese?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Mhm.
Standard, like, here, come eat, kind of thing. And so, yeah, I've had good memories with making dumplings with grandma, making hot pot with family, things like that. Always so good. 8 course, 10 course Chinese traditional dinners in Queens. And then I guess another thing is, yeah, just along with the idea of food though, it's just like how family first we are. Not only for elders, and I think we are a high honor, high respect culture, right? We want to continue to honor and value our elders. My grandpa actually is in the middle of a multiple year project where he's writing a memoir of his life. And so that's been really interesting. And he's given us various chapters to review and edit as he completes those. And it's just been super cool and something that we're gonna like love and treasure, to have all of his stories written down and being able to pass down. And I think that's something that he appreciates too, that he feels like it's also a responsibility for himself too, to carry on and pass values and different things like that to the generations after. And so I think that's a big thing, family and being there for holidays and traditions and making an effort to come home for those and being together is a big thing. So.
Well, that's interesting that you say that with the whole family first, right? With your Chinese name, that the first thing is your last name, right? And then your individual name.
Yeah.
And it's so reflective of that whole idea that it's a communal mentality where your family and your family name is more important than the individual.
Yeah.
And that runs so counter to Western society and Western culture, where it's always the individual and what I want and what I'm going to do and forge my own path. That a lot of times we don't see people necessarily taking into account, how does this affect family or things like that. Well, thank you guys for spending time here with this conversation and just allowing people to catch a glimpse of who you are, where your heart is, what's going through your mind, but also getting to understand your culture. And I think it's significant that tonight we have everyone on this gallery has been raised in North America, because I think that gives a very, very different perspective than for people who immigrated here. But it's also a story that we don't hear of very often. Oftentimes when we think of Asians, I think generally people think of those who immigrated here, and not necessarily those who were born and raised here. And like you guys said, a lot of times we identify a whole lot more with Western society than we do with our Chinese roots. But I think it's valuable to hear from you guys as